All right, let's build some walls. So I have my small rocks and my medium-sized rocks again. And I did some work off the camera. So I put down a layer of very small rocks on top of the dirt that will become the floor. And then I started piling up larger rocks on top of the rubble trench. And the purpose of both of these layers is the same, is to keep water out of the dwelling. So the reason you can't just build your cob walls directly on top of the rubble trench is because it's too close to the dirt. And the cob really can't ever become very wet. It can become a little bit wet, but not totally saturated. And if you put some rocks, like some larger rocks, especially between the ground and your walls, it's going to be very hard for water to travel up through those rocks and make the walls fall apart. And the same thing is going to be true for the floor eventually. So I put down a bunch of small rocks. This would be like putting down gravel if you were making a larger dwelling. And the purpose of that gravel is that it's going to isolate whatever flooring I put on top from the moisture of the ground below. And if you were making a large house in a wet climate, you would probably also want to put at least some kind of tarp down under the gravel. In a drier climate you don't have to, but you really don't want your floor getting too wet or a lot of moisture coming up through it. And then it also does kind of depend on what your floor is made out of. If you have an earthen floor, it might be a little bit more resistant to getting a little bit wet. If you have a wood floor, it really can't get wet at all, so you definitely would put some kind of tarp or maybe even like a rubber membrane of some kind below there. But for this small dwelling in an environment where I'm going to be controlling the rain, it's not really necessary to do that. I'm just going to put some small rocks, and that should be enough to keep the moisture out of the floor. Okay, so I'm going to keep going with both of these layers so you can see how it works. It's very simple. For the, we'll call it the subfloor, which just means the floor below the floor. I just spread some of these small rocks, and again, these are washed off. If they're full of dirt, that dirt is going to allow moisture to come up through the gravel. And that's because dirt wicks moisture. Wicking is it's a process where moisture is transferred from one part of another when one part is more dry than the other. Like you probably notice if you get water on your sleeves or on your clothes, it spreads out, and that's due to wicking also. And the same thing happens with dirt, but it happens much less with rocks because rocks don't absorb as much moisture and they don't absorb it as quickly. And especially a lot of small rocks that are only touching each other on like a very small part of their surface, they're not going to wick moisture very quickly, so they're going to keep the moisture isolated in the ground, hopefully. And some subfloors are very thick with gravel, and that will depend on how much gravel you have and how much you're willing to pay for it, perhaps, or also like how high you want your floor raised off the ground. It can also serve a kind of insulating purpose. Raising your floor off the ground, even with gravel, will keep it a little warmer if you have some kind of heat source inside your building. And certainly if you use like an extra rubber barrier or something, that's going to provide an insulating effect as well. Okay, so now for these walls, what I did is I took some of these larger stones, and this is a part of the building process that it's very different in a small scale than it would be on a large scale. In a large scale, it would be very important to find stones of specific shapes and sizes that fit together very, very nicely and tightly so that they wouldn't shift at all when a lot of weight comes down upon them, unless you were going to use some kind of mortar. Mortar is like a mineral glue that holds rocks together. It's what's in the walls of foundations where you see rocks and there's like a gray stuff in between. That's a kind of mortar. And there are mortars that natural builders use. I'm not probably going to get into that in this course, although you might read about it in some of the reading. But for this small of a scale, the rocks aren't really going to shift enough that it's going to matter. I mean, I am trying to put like little tiny rocks in between to make, things as solid as I can, but on this scale, it's just a bit too tedious to try and find properly sized tiny rocks and put them together perfectly, because they're so light that you just bump them and they move around. It's not as satisfying as laying large rocks. And I don't know that there's a right height here. It's just really enough to get your walls off of the ground, away from like any vegetation or dirt. I guess if you were building a large structure, the base of your walls, I don't know, it might be at least 6 inches or a foot to keep the building elevated. But it would also depend, on like the environment and how much water there was. I'm also putting some rocks on, like, I don't know how to explain it. So I'm putting the rocks kind of sloping outwards, so they'll go all the way down to the ground at an angle, and then I'm only going to build my wall on really the inside rocks. And the outside rocks are going to just provide an extra barrier to keep things from seeping into the foundation or growing in there. Might speed this part up. Okay, it's time to start building walls. So I got my cob that I made last week. It's messy. Feels like it's probably some of the water has absorbed in the clay. Feels kind of dry. Add a little water to it. And it does have a little bit of a smell, like some of that grass might already be starting to rot a little bit, which is fine for our purposes, but I want to make it fresh. You don't want it to stink at all. Alright, so now this is another part that's going to be fairly different in this small scale than it would have been if you're building a large structure. If you're building a large structure, you would make these little pieces. I mean, they'd be big. They'd be like this piece, but for our small scale, they'd be like, you know, I don't know, like this or something. And mostly just because that's what's comfortable to lift. And you put them on top of the stones. Well, you might even like throw them down at the stones, but you try and get them to kind of mush in, not like enough that they're going into the gaps of the stones and really like attaching firmly, but you don't want to like grind it all the way down so you've got like dirt running through your stones, because the whole point of the stones is to keep the cob out of the ground. But you want it enough that they're attached. So this would be the kind of method you'd use, these little pieces, and you'd squish them together, and you might even use like your thumbs or some sticks to like kind of press and like make holes and dents in them so they really like fit together really well. And so that some of the fibers like link the different pieces together. Yeah, that's kind of how you do it. For our purposes, it's not really necessary, so I'm just going to use larger pieces. A little bit of a cheat. But it should work just fine. So the first course, it's called, or the first row of cob you put down, you're really just trying to make sure it attaches to those rocks. So what you probably couldn't do is take like a huge handful and just set it on top, because then you won't be able to like work it into the rocks very easily. And if you're building your wall, this part would take a really long time. And it might take, well, it almost certainly would take more than one day, which introduces a challenge that we won't have for building our models, because this is easy to finish in one sitting. But you would have to figure out a way to keep the cob wet when you're not working on it, because once it dries out, it's kind of tricky to really get it to evenly re-moisten without falling apart. And it's not going to attach to itself if part of it's dry and part of it's wet. So often people will cover an unfinished wall with a tarp to keep it damp. The danger there is if you do that too long, your straw or your organic material inside the cob is going to start to rot. So you kind of have to be committed to like finishing it in a fairly small number of days if you really want it to be good and strong and adhere to itself really well. Or I suppose you could slowly like build here and attach, and like, you know, by the time you got around, this part might be dry, but maybe that would be like a doorway or something. You know, you could figure it out, but it's got to be wet to attach to itself. And so my wall is going to be thinner than the rocks, and that's intentional. It's also going to get a little thinner as it goes up, which is just going to give it extra strength and stability at the bottom. I'm kind of feeling like it might actually be fun to get like a pencil and do the line parts. Well, maybe. Yeah. There we go. You might not have one of these at home, but pencil I think would work fine. So I'm going to make these holes in it. Yeah, this is neat. is what you do. You make a bunch of holes, and that creates this kind of like looseness on the surface of the wall. And then the next layer is going to be able to kind of smush those holes and like smush down into the cob. It'll make it bond better, easier. And if you're feeling like, wait a second, my walls look like they got grass or straw poking out of them all over, that's okay. That's kind of just how it is. You would ultimately like finish your walls with a different material, maybe like just some clay, kind of mud plaster, or some kind of lime or paint or something. So how they're looking right now isn't going to be the finished look. So don't worry about making it look too pretty. All right, I'll probably speed this part up a little. So you might be wondering, hold on a second, what about the doors and windows? Well, another advantage of our working on a small scale is that we can fudge the doors and windows a little bit. If you were building a big thing, you'd have to have it all planned out, exactly where you wanted the doors and windows, and you'd probably frame them out with wood while you're putting the cob on. Because this is a small thing and I can build the whole thing in an hour and move stuff around before it dries, this is not necessary. So I'm going to add some windows now. So one of the neatest things about Cob, I think, is that you can add glass without any kind of frame at all directly into Cob, and the Cob can act as a frame. I think you need to seal around the glass in some way that I have not researched yet, but you don't need to use any wood at all necessarily. So I'm going to demonstrate that. So I have a glass bottle here, and I'm going to carefully take some fabric and wrap it. And I want adult supervision for this part, honestly. I mean, I don't think it's tremendously dangerous if you take the precaution of wrapping it first. But just know that, when glass breaks, it's going to be sharp. And I'm just going to hit it. If you didn't have a hammer, of course you could use a rock or something else hard, or throw it outside or whatever. Okay, let's see what we got. Careful. This is kind of what I was looking for. What's this piece? So I'm going to embed the glass in the cob a little ways. Now, very careful, it's sharp. I'm going to make sure the cob is overlapping the glass along all the edges so that it's held in place. Don't worry about getting it clean right now. You can come back later and do that once the cob is dried. A window of this size might be a little bit unrealistic for a building. It would have to be very thick glass to be that large. But what I'm finding is it's hard to get my small windows as close together as I would be able to if this were a larger project and I could really get in there and finesse those details. So I'm going to use a couple larger windows because I really want to simulate the effects of a lot of sunlight coming into the structure. That's going to be part of my building's performance testing. It's going to be how well it stays warm, like how much of a kind of greenhouse effect it has due to energy coming in from the light. So I want a lot of glass. One of the recommendations of one of those books is that if you're building a large structure, a good place to get big, strong pieces of glass, and even sometimes double pane glass, which insulates more, is from sliding doors. You can get old, unwanted, or maybe there's a crack in one part of it, but you can use the rest of it. Sliding doors from somewhere, and it's an easy way to get glass that no one needs anymore. And as people often do, I'm putting a lot of glass on one side of the building. Depending on your climate, whether you're trying to keep the building warm or cool, this would usually be the south side. which is where the sun comes from. It's the south during the hottest part of the day. So that's going to help me capture extra warmth. It's funny working with this small model because everything is so damp, doesn't have time to dry out before you add the next part, so the whole thing feels really mushy, but a large structure would be drying as you're building, and so the bottoms would already be more solid by the time you're this high. And of course, if you're nervous about using glass or don't have access to it, plastic is going to work just fine. The clearer the better if you want some solar energy to come through. And you can just cut plastic with the scissors, whatever shape you want if you've got a big chunk of it. Another thing you'd have to be careful about if you're building a larger structure is the weight of the cob coming down on the glass. So especially the spots where I've got windows on top of windows, you'd have to be really careful about making sure your windows were thick enough that they could support the weight of any cob coming down, and that ideally you'd want probably some kind of triangle structure to disperse as much of the weight as possible into the cob. Rather than the glass itself. The glass is very strong, especially if it's thick. Cob it's very heavy, especially in the large structures, so you have to be pretty mindful of that. Alright, so I'm gonna let this dry a little bit. I gotta make some more cob, and I might find some more glass. But yeah, I'm satisfied that this is coming. Yeah, it's funny, one of those books they said you always need more material than you think. And so I thought I had enough cob, and I had half of it. Find how it is. Alright, bye.